Some secrets are too dark to stay buried. This is the story history tried to erase, the terrifying pact of Mr. Whitmore and his wives. They tried to bury this truth. In 1847, 4 wives vanished in the Utah wilderness. What if it wasn't just a disappearance, but an unholy sacrifice? Imagine. A stillness so profound, only the howl of the Utah winter dared to speak. Then, silence. For 4 women. Vanished. In 1857, from a remote settlement without a single print in the snow, their husband, Ezekiel Whitmore, claimed they simply departed. An impossible journey in the most brutal winter on record. This truth you were never meant to hear. For over 60 years, this incident remained classified, locked away in the private archives of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a secret buried so deep it festered. Until 1920. Construction workers, breaking ground for a new meeting house, struck something beneath the chapel's foundation. Not just earth, but a discovery so abhorrent, so utterly contradictory to the sanctity it once claimed, that it would force the highest echelons of leadership to confront the darkest chapter in their early Utah history. What they found was not merely physical evidence, but a gaping wound in the narrative of faith, family, and the divine price of building Zion in the wilderness. This wasn't just a disappearance. This was an unholy pact, a perversion of celestial glory, concealed by an institution desperate to preserve its sacred image. The truth about the winter that changed everything wasn't just hidden. It was actively suppressed, because some secrets are too terrible to stay buried forever, and once unearthed, they demand to be heard. This is the truth that will make you question everything you thought you knew about faith, power, and the terrifying cost of absolute devotion. Are you ready to see what they hid? The Utah Territory of 1847 was no promised land of milk and honey. It was a crucible, 1,000 square miles of alkaline desert brutally bracketed by mountains designed to trap and isolate. For months on end, Brigham Young's followers would be cut off, forced to confront not just the elements, but the raw, unfiltered truth of their own resilience. Yet, for the Mormon pioneers, this desolation was providence, a divinely chosen proving ground where they could finally forge their faith, free from the very persecutions that had relentlessly driven them from Missouri, from Illinois, from every place they had dared to call home. This wilderness was meant to be Zion. But sometimes, the very foundations of a promised land can hide cracks, fissures through which a darker reality bleeds. Ezekiel Whitmore, a man of quiet intensity, arrived in this valley with the second wave of migration in late September of 1847. He was a skilled carpenter from Vermont, 34 years old, a convert drawn by the magnetic pull of Joseph Smith's revelations. What truly set Whitmore apart, however, wasn't just his craft or his quiet demeanor. It was the living testament to a radical secret doctrine. He traveled with 4 wives, all legally married to him under the principle of plural marriage, a truth the church practiced in whispered tones, shrouded in necessity and celestial promise. This secret, held close, would become a profound vulnerability in the unforgiving isolation of the wild. These weren't just wives, they were cornerstones of a complex, precarious design, each chosen for a specific purpose, each a piece in Ezekiel's unfolding spiritual architecture. There was Sarah, his first wife, 31, her spirit etched with the quiet resilience of 8 years married to this singular man. Her graying hair spoke not just of age, but of a subtle weariness. Sarah was barren, a simple biological fact that, in the rigid theology of Mormonism, morphed into a divine mandate for plural marriage itself. For her, it was not just acceptable, but a pathway, a necessary sacrifice towards the highest degree of celestial glory. A chilling thought, that barrenness could necessitate such a radical solution, pushing a woman to select another to share her sacred bond. Then came Rebecca Thornton, 27, selected by Sarah herself in 1845. Rebecca was an anomaly, a woman of sharp intellect, unusual for her time, fluent in both English and German. She harbored a dangerous inclination. She questioned doctrine. Her mind probed the edges of dogma, challenging the comfortable certainties of most Mormon men. Yet Ezekiel, peculiar in his own right, seemed to value this intellectual contribution, perhaps even found a perverse utility in it for his own unfolding vision. Mary Kellerman, the third wife, joined their nascent family just before the arduous journey west in early 1847. At 24, she was already pregnant with her first child, her body suffering gravely during the brutal trek across the plains. Orphaned during the unsettling Nauvoo period, Mary had no family but the Whitmore household, a vulnerable soul tethered by circumstance to Ezekiel's ever-expanding claim. Finally, Ruth Caldwell, barely 19, the youngest and newest addition, integrated into the family just 3 months before their departure for Utah. Her marriage was a pragmatic arrangement, orchestrated by church elders who deemed her in need of protection after her own family was lost in the brutal Missouri conflicts. 4 distinct souls, woven into one man's complex, isolating design, each carrying their own quiet desperation or unspoken purpose, unknowingly stepping into a pact far grander and far more sinister than they could ever comprehend. Their chosen sanctuary, a place that would later be known as Mill Creek, lay approximately 8 miles southeast of the main Salt Lake settlement. Ezekiel selected it not merely for the promise of year-round water or its fertile ground. No, his true motive lay deeper, chillingly intertwined with his very nature. The isolation of Mill Creek suited his temperament, a man who consistently preferred the quiet company of his wives and the focused intensity of his work over the tedious social obligations of community life. He was a private man, and this remote valley offered the ultimate canvas for his singular vision. That first brutal autumn, a desperate intensity gripped Ezekiel. He worked with the driven fervor of a man possessed, preparing for the crushing embrace of winter. He raised a formidable cabin, its thick log walls and stone foundation a defiant bulwark against the encroaching desolation. It was large, designed with separate rooms for each wife, adhering to the meticulous, almost ritualistic protocols developed by Mormon men for managing plural households in the wilderness. But this structure, solid and imposing, stood utterly alone for miles in every direction. Their nearest neighbors, a family of Danish converts, were a mere 3 miles north. Yet, once the snow began to fall, even that meager connection would be severed, leaving the Whitmores in an unbroken silence, ripe for whatever transpired within its unyielding walls. This wasn't just isolation by circumstance. It was chosen, cultivated, a stage set for a drama only Ezekiel could orchestrate. In those nascent years, the Mormon community understood a fundamental truth. Survival in the harsh wilderness was a collective endeavor. Every family's existence hinged upon a fragile lattice of cooperation, shared resources, and unwavering mutual support. Church leaders, acutely aware of the perilous tightrope walked by those in plural marriages, maintained strict oversight. This wasn't merely for theological purity. It was a pragmatic necessity, born from the complex human dynamics of managing multiple relationships under crushing isolation. Men who embraced plural marriage were expected to cultivate an unwavering harmony within their households and to contribute positively, unequivocally, to the community's fragile welfare. Public image was everything. Ezekiel Whitmore's wives, each a vital cog in his remote domestic machine, played their parts with quiet efficiency, painting a veneer of order. Sarah, the first wife, managed the domestic affairs with a silent, almost chilling precision, meticulously organizing the stores for the long winter, orchestrating the textile production like a silent general. Rebecca, the intellectual, meticulously catalogued every supply, every expenditure, her mind already branching into basic medical skills, a chilling foresight for what might come. Mary, burdened by pregnancy yet unyielding, preserved their food stores with an almost desperate efficiency, a bulwark against scarcity. And Ruth, the youngest, a flicker of youthful energy, embraced the heaviest physical labor, her optimism a fragile counterpoint to the unspoken weight settling upon the isolated cabin. On the surface, the Whitmore household was a testament to industry, a carefully curated image of a thriving, harmonious unit, but beneath this veneer of efficiency, a darker current stirred, unseen, unheard, waiting to claim its due. By December of 1847, as the biting grip of winter began to tighten, the Whitmore household presented an image of remarkable prosperity, a beacon of righteous living in the brutal wilderness. Church records, meticulously kept, paint a portrait of Ezekiel making regular, dutiful trips to the main settlement, trading goods, attending meetings, participating in the communal illusion. His wives, seen by fleeting visitors, were described as healthy, well-dressed and, most notably, remarkably harmonious for a plural family, a testament, it seemed, to spiritual blessing and proper order within the home. Bishop William Curtis, a man of God entrusted with the spiritual oversight of these isolated souls, visited the cabin in early December. In his official journal, a public record of faith and progress, he would later commend the Whitmore family, noting their unusual unity and prosperity. A shining example, he declared, of dedication to the path of righteousness. Yet the official narrative often hides the most unsettling truths. What Bishop Curtis meticulously omitted from his public testament, what he confided only to the trembling pages of his private diary, was a profound disquiet. The four women, he noted, seemed too harmonious, finishing each other's sentences with an eerie precision, moving in an unnervingly synchronized ballet. It was as if a single invisible mind commanded multiple bodies. And then, the marks. Small, deliberate cuts on their wrists, identical in age and depth. Kitchen accidents, they claimed, their smiles unwavering. But the bishop, a man who saw beneath the veneer of piety, felt the chilling whisper of a far more sinister explanation. These were not accidents, these were sigils, and the harmony, a terrifying symphony of control. The winter of 1847 to 1848 was not merely harsh, it was a living, breathing entity of cold, a monstrous test designed to break the unprepared. Snow began its relentless descent in mid-November, a shroud of white that fell intermittently through March, burying the land in an unforgiving silence. Temperatures plunged to 20 below zero, carving through bone and spirit, while the wind, a howling beast, roared across the valley with enough force to tear a grown man from his feet. For the families huddled in the main settlement, this brutal season was a challenge, yes, but a manageable one, softened by community, by shared warmth and collective resilience. But for isolated homesteads like the Whitmores, it was something else entirely. It became the ultimate crucible, a raw, elemental test of their very foundations, their preparation, their faith, their endurance. It was within this suffocating isolation, under the iron grip of the winter, that the last flickering light of the four women was definitively witnessed, December 19th, 1847. A group of men hunting past the cabin. They saw smoke. They spoke briefly with Sarah and Rebecca, who appeared at the door to accept a gift of deer meat. Their politeness was unsettling, their smiles perhaps a touch too fixed. They declined the invitation to send someone back for Christmas services, claiming they would hold their own family worship, a private ritual, a turning away from the collective faith that defined their community. This was more than an anomaly. It was a deliberate choice, a final, chilling act of separation before the true darkness descended. And what happened next would not only puzzle investigators for decades, but forge the most persistent, most disturbing mystery in early Mormon Utah history, a truth so well buried it would only resurface when the very ground gave way. The first chilling tremor that something had fractured in the isolation of Mill Creek came on January 8, 1848. The winter, now a relentless siege, was at its peak when Ezekiel Whitmore reappeared at the main settlement. Not as the diligent, stoic pioneer, but as a ghost. Those who witnessed his arrival that frigid day described a man who seemed to have aged years in a mere 3 weeks. His clothes, once orderly, hung disheveled. His beard, usually meticulously kept, was unkempt, a testament to neglect, but it was his eyes that truly held the horror. One witness, haunted by the sight, would later describe it as the look of a man who had seen too much, a phrase that carries the weight of unspeakable trauma, a silent scream etched into the soul. In the stark, forced privacy of Bishop Curtis's cabin, Ezekiel spun his first tale. His wife Sarah, he claimed, had received a divine revelation, a calling to travel east, to Missouri, to care for a sick sister no one had ever known she possessed. He spoke of an urgency so profound she couldn't wait for spring, departing with a small, phantom group of travelers who had supposedly passed through their area. Bishop Curtis, a man whose faith was anchored in pragmatic reality, was instantly riddled with suspicion. No sane traveler would attempt such a journey in the dead of winter, and Sarah, the barren one, suddenly had a sister in Missouri. As the bishop pressed, the narrative began to buckle. Ezekiel's story shifted like sand in a gale. First, the travelers were missionaries, then mountain men who knew secret winter routes. His hands, clenched beneath the table, trembled visibly, and his eyes, still holding that haunted gaze, darted towards the door, as if expecting someone to enter, or perhaps something. This was the first thread, and it was rotten to its core. But the deepest well of Bishop Curtis's suspicion was yet to be poisoned. Most disturbing was Ezekiel's fervent insistence that the bishop, a spiritual shepherd, should not visit the cabin, not to check on the remaining wives, not to offer comfort in the bleak isolation. Ezekiel claimed they were observing a period of spiritual purification, a sacred undertaking that demanded absolute, unbroken isolation. A convenient shield, this, against prying eyes, cloaking whatever unholy rites or desperate truths might reside within those walls. The absurdity of it, in the midst of the most brutal winter, was a stark affront to common sense and communal practice. Bishop Curtis, a man whose faith was as unyielding as the Utah rock, meticulously recorded the conversation in his official journal, a sanitized account for the public eye. But it was in the trembling hand, etched into the private pages of his hidden diary, that his true alarm was laid bare. He wrote, a tremor of doubt shaking his very soul. Brother Whitmore speaks of revelations, but I fear he may be concealing something far more earthly and terrible. A chilling indictment, born from the raw intuition of a man who understood the depths of human depravity. His manner, Curtis noted, suggests guilt rather than grief, and his explanations contradict both reason and the season. This was no longer just about a missing woman. It was about a man consumed by a secret so profound, so heinous, that it twisted his very being, corrupting the sacred language of faith to mask an unspeakable act. The shadow of an unspeakable terror had begun to fall over the isolated cabin, a grim silhouette cast by the deepening winter and Ezekiel's increasingly desperate lies. 3 weeks later, on January 30th, the chilling charade intensified. Ezekiel Whitmore, gaunter, his eyes even more sunken, reappeared at the settlement with an even more disturbing report. Rebecca, the intellectual, the questioner, had also received a calling, this time to serve as a teacher in a mission school far to the east, and of course she too had departed with another group of travelers, taking only essential supplies into the unforgiving maw of the Utah winter. The sheer audacity of the lie was almost breathtaking. Bishop Curtis, his patience now worn thin as a winter thread, demanded to know what phantom travelers could possibly be moving through Utah territory in February. The season itself screamed contradiction. Ezekiel's response this time was a rambling, incoherent torrent, a desperate cascade of references to God's mysterious ways and trials of faith. The pious platitudes, once a shield, now sounded like the panicked mutterings of a trapped man. This time, the bishop's suspicions transcended mere alarm. They solidified into grim conviction. He insisted on visiting the cabin. He would see the remaining wives for himself. Ezekiel's agitated response was immediate, almost violent in its desperation. Mary and Ruth, he claimed, were too ill to receive visitors, suffering from a fever that could be contagious. Another convenient barrier, another layer of concealment. He promised to bring them to the settlement as soon as they recovered, a desperate, hollow pledge hanging in the frigid air. But the bishop's resolve was now absolute. The truth, buried deep, was about to be unearthed, no matter how great the personal cost. The game was over. The bishop's suspicions, now hardened into an unyielding resolve, could no longer be ignored. On February the 3rd, just days after Ezekiel's last desperate plea, Bishop Curtis marshaled a group of 5 resolute men. The journey through the snow-choked hills was a brutal testament to the winter's savage grip, treacherous beyond measure, consuming most of their day despite the relatively short distance. Every step was a battle against the elements, each icy breath a reminder of the isolation Ezekiel had so carefully curated. When they finally arrived at the cabin, a silent sentinel against the stark landscape, they found Ezekiel alone. A single insufficient fire gnawed at the vast structure's cold heart, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with unspoken secrets. He greeted them with a forced, nervous courtesy, his eyes still holding that haunted, evasive quality. And then the new narrative. His wives, Mary and Ruth, had miraculously recovered from their contagious fever. In fact, he claimed, they had decided to join Sarah and Rebecca in the east, departing just 2 days earlier with a passing group of trappers who had promised safe passage to civilization. The lie, now threadbare, stretched to breaking point. The bishop and his men stood on the precipice of a revelation. They had entered Ezekiel's isolated domain, and now the descent truly began. The air inside Ezekiel's cabin was heavy, not just with the biting chill of the Utah winter, but with the suffocating weight of pretense. Ezekiel, with forced graciousness, led the bishop and his men through several rooms, hastily cleared out, stripped of the vibrant clutter of daily life. Clothing, books, personal effects, all gone, he claimed, taken by his wives on their miraculous journey east. But the discerning eyes of the bishop caught the glaring inconsistencies. Heavy items, cumbersome pieces of furniture, robust cooking implements, these remained unmoved. A stark contradiction to the narrative of women making a permanent departure into the wilderness. No one sheds their most vital anchors for a desperate flight. And then, outside the cabin, the truth began to claw its way to the surface. Behind the solitary structure, unmistakable signs of recent digging marred the pristine snow. Disturbed earth, dark against the white, spoke of strenuous, desperate labor. Ezekiel, ever quick with a convenient truth, claimed he was expanding the root cellar, preparing for the next winter. A mundane chore, cloaking a monstrous act. But the ground, hardened by the brutal winter, was frozen solid. The sheer volume of disturbed earth was far greater than any simple food storage area would require. When one of the men, his voice laced with unspoken doubt, commented on the impossibility of digging in such conditions, Ezekiel's response was sharp, almost venomous in its defensiveness. "God's work," he bit out, "requires dedication even in the hardest conditions." A chilling testament revealing not piety but a desperate, unhinged commitment to a task far darker than any man could imagine. The truth was there, in the overturned soil, begging to be seen. The night spent within the walls of Ezekiel's cabin was a haunting experience for the visiting party, an oppressive silence that settled into their very bones. Several of the men later recounted feeling a profound, inexplicable unease, a sense of something fundamentally wrong pervading the very air. The building itself was too quiet. No rustling of skirts, no soft, murmured conversations, none of the subtle, mundane sounds that spoke of women's presence, of lives lived, of routines observed. The cabin, built to shelter, now felt like a tomb, echoing with an absence that screamed louder than any noise. Ezekiel, the solitary host, served them a meal that consisted entirely of preserved foods, a stark contradiction to the expectation that fresh bread and dairy products, staples of a managed household, should have been readily available if his wives were indeed tending to their domestic duties. This unnatural scarcity, this deliberate offering of only that which could endure, served as another disquieting signal. But the true horror of the night belonged to Thomas Garrett, one of the visiting men. He awoke to a sound that clawed at the edges of his sanity. The faint, yet distinct, sound of weeping. It seemed to emanate from somewhere beneath the cabin, a soft, heartbroken lament in the frozen earth. When he spoke of it the next morning, the others, unnerved themselves, dismissed it as merely the wind, or the settling of timber in the extreme cold. Yet Garrett remained convinced. He had heard human voices in distress, a chilling echo from the depths, a desperate plea perhaps from those who had once walked the earth above. The bishop's party departed the next morning, leaving Ezekiel's silent cabin behind, but carrying far more questions than answers. The chilling incident of the weeping, though dismissed by some, festered in their minds, a seed of doubt planted in the frozen ground. Back in the relative safety of the main settlement, Bishop Curtis retreated to the sacred solitude of his private journal. There, on pages meant only for his eyes, he poured out the escalating horror of his convictions. "I fear," he penned, his hand heavy with dread, "that Brother Whitmore may have committed acts that will bring shame upon our people and our faith." A profound, devastating admission, hinting at an evil far greater than mere disappearance. He wrestled with the grim calculus of isolation, acknowledging how the suffocating pressures of winter could warp a man's spirit, pushing him to desperate, unspeakable measures. He voiced his fear that the very principles of plural marriage, sacred as they were, might have proven too great a burden for Ezekiel's tormented soul. Yet, a more formidable spectre loomed over Bishop Curtis, the survival of his nascent community. The Mormon people were already under the relentless scrutiny of the federal government, their unconventional practices a constant target. Any public revelation of suspected murders, of impropriety within a polygamous household, would provide devastating ammunition for anti-Mormon forces. It could, quite literally, justify government intervention, threatening the very existence of their fragile, hard-won Zion. After agonizing consultation with other church leaders, a chilling decision was made. The entire incident, the horrifying truth of the Whitmore cabin, would be classified as confidential, suppressed, buried not in the earth but in the archives of institutional memory. The truth sacrificed for the sake of the collective, a despera, to compromise made in the chilling name of survival. What price, then, is truly paid for progress in the wilderness? Throughout the remaining, unforgiving winter months, Ezekiel Whitmore continued his haunting charade. He reappeared at the settlement with chilling regularity, always alone, always growing gaunter, his frame shrinking under the weight of an unseen burden. He maintained the pretense of a man whose wives were merely absent, spinning tales of regular correspondence, of letters arriving from the east confirming their safe arrival and their newfound happiness, a domestic bliss transplanted, thriving in a distant land. But the phantom letters never materialized. When pressed, Ezekiel would deflect, claiming they were too personal to share, or more conveniently, that he had accidentally destroyed them in the fire. Each flimsy excuse, each forced smile, chipped away at the fragile trust of the community. A low hum of whispers began to ripple through the close-knit settlement, a creeping unease that mirrored the tightening grip of winter. Some, perhaps clinging to the simplest explanation, rationalized that Ezekiel had merely sent his wives away. Perhaps he could no longer support such a complex household, or the crushing isolation had finally fractured the fragile harmony of plural marriage. But others, those with eyes sharp enough to pierce the veil of public decorum, suspected a truth far more sinister. They pointed to Ezekiel's increasingly erratic behavior, the glaring inconsistencies in his ever-changing narrative. The man was unraveling, piece by agonizing piece, a testament to the dark secrets he harbored. The truth remained hidden, shielded by the last vestiges of winter's embrace, waiting for the spring thaw to reveal secrets that would challenge everything the community believed about faith, family, and the true price of survival in the wilderness. And then, as if the very land conspired to reveal the hidden, the snows melted. April of 1848 brought not just the thaw of winter's grip, but the grim opportunity for Bishop Curtis to finally conduct the thorough, unhindered investigation he had so desperately yearned for. What he discovered at the Whitmore property would not only haunt him for the remainder of his life, but would fester as a dark, unyielding mystery for over 70 years, a testament to the horror that unfolded in that isolated crucible. The cabin, once a symbol of fervent devotion and domestic order, now stood utterly abandoned. A thick, oppressive layer of dust lay undisturbed across the furniture, a silent witness to weeks, perhaps months of eerie vacancy. The rooms, those once meticulously managed by the four wives, bore the chilling hallmarks of hasty cleaning, a frantic attempt to erase evidence rather than the signs of a normal, voluntary departure. No personal touches, no lingering warmth, just an unsettling emptiness that screamed of absence, of lives abruptly, violently extinguished. This was not the quiet leaving of women journeying eastward. This was the cold, clinical aftermath of an unspeakable act, concealed within the very fabric of the home. The ground, now softened by the spring, was ready to yield its deeper, more terrible secrets, secrets that had been crying out from beneath the earth, waiting for the light. But the true devastation lay in the small, carefully hidden details, screaming contradictions to Ezekiel's desperate narrative. Beneath a loose floorboard in what had been Rebecca's room, Bishop Curtis discovered a leather-bound journal, Rebecca's most treasured possession, a sanctuary for her thoughts and observations since joining this peculiar family. Its concealment spoke volumes. As the bishop's trembling fingers opened the worn cover, he found the final entry, dated December 20th, 1847, the day after the last sighting of the four women. It was written in a hand that shook with a profound, bone-deep terror, a testament to the horror that had consumed her final moments. The cryptic sentence, etched onto the page, became a chilling epitaph. E says, "We must all make the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of the eternal family. But I fear his revelations come from a darker source than heaven." The words were a poisoned arrow, piercing the carefully constructed facade of pious devotion. E. Ezekiel, ultimate sacrifice, a perversion of a sacred principle, darker source than heaven, a horrifying confirmation of insidious corruption. This was not the voluntary departure of devout women fulfilling a calling. This was the final desperate testament of a soul consumed by dread, trapped in a horrifying pact conceived not in divine light, but in the chilling shadows of a twisted mind. The very bedrock of their faith, the promise of celestial glory, had been warped into a justification for unspeakable acts. The truth, once confined to Bishop Curtis's private fears, now screamed from Rebecca's final desperate words. But the true, unvarnished horror lay not just in Rebecca's final desperate words, but in the earth itself. Behind the cabin, the area Ezekiel had frantically claimed was merely an expansion for a root cellar, told a chillingly different story. The disturbed earth, torn from the frozen ground, covered a far vaster expanse than any simple food storage would require. The digging, it was clear, had been no single desperate act, but a methodical, staggered excavation spanning several brutal weeks, a testament to grim, unyielding labor under the cloak of night. And then the unearthed revelations. Partially buried in the churned soil, the bishop's gaze fell upon fragments of fabric, threads of color and weave that chillingly matched the descriptions of clothing worn by the four missing wives. Personal items, too, lay scattered amongst the earth, a comb, a ribbon, and finally a wedding ring. Sarah's ring, the very symbol of her sacred bond to Ezekiel, worn since their marriage, now desecrated, discarded. This was no longer just a disappearance, this was the desecration of lives, and the abyss deepened further. In a cleared area near the digging site, the chilling evidence of a dark ritual emerged. The remains of multiple fires, not practical hearths, but arranged in a specific, deliberate pattern, speaking of occult purpose. Mixed with the ashes were burned fragments of paper, pages torn from religious texts, but not from any standard Mormon publications. The legible pieces, scorched and brittle, spoke of blood atonement and eternal sealing through sacrifice. Concepts twisted from their sacred roots, interpreted in ways that sickened the bishop, revealing a perversion of faith so profound, so utterly horrifying, that it hinted at ancient corruption festering beneath the veneer of modern devotion. This was the horrifying tableau of the Unholy Pact made manifest. The final, damning piece of this gruesome puzzle was unearthed not in the soil, but in the twisted labyrinth of Ezekiel's own mind. In the room that had belonged to Ezekiel and Sarah. A hidden compartment yielded its terrible secrets. Several notebooks filled with Ezekiel's frantic, obsessive handwriting. These weren't mere journals. They were the manifestos of a man descending into self-made damnation, documenting his growing fixation with what he chillingly called the principle of ultimate consecration, a belief twisted beyond recognition, demanding the faithful surrender everything, even life itself, to achieve the highest degree of celestial glory. The notebooks laid bare the terrifying trajectory of his madness. They revealed Ezekiel's dark scholarship, his fervent study of obscure religious texts far removed from the common liturgy. He had come to believe, with a terrifying certainty, that his family, his 4 wives, had been chosen for a special, horrifying mission, an extraordinary sacrifice, divinely ordained, that only they could fulfill. The final entries spiraled into a vortex of delusion. His handwriting grew increasingly erratic, a visual testament to his unraveling sanity. He wrote of receiving visions, glorious and terrifying, visions that promised him eternal glory, an unparalleled celestial ascension for families who proved their absolute, unquestioning devotion through the ultimate sacrifice. And then, the chilling crescendo, disturbing explicit references to the willing offering of innocence and the sealing power of shed blood. This wasn't just a perversion of faith, it was the calculated, chilling blueprint of a psychological control system, an ancient corruption of the divine, meticulously documented in his own hand, a truth so vile it shattered the very concept of sanctity. Bishop Curtis, a man of God now burdened by a truth too terrible to bear, faced an impossible situation. The evidence, unearthed from the frozen earth and from the very pages of Ezekiel's demented mind, screamed of murder, not merely the taking of lives, but a ritualistic slaughter, a perversion so profound it desecrated the very concept of faith. But Ezekiel himself had vanished, dissolved into the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Western Territories, leaving no trace, no whisper of his whereabouts or intentions. The bishop's desperate attempts to track him proved futile. Ezekiel Whitmore had simply chosen to lose himself, to become another ghost in the endless, unforgiving landscape. The church leadership, presented with Bishop Curtis's grim findings, convened in agonizing secrecy. Their decision, agonizing yet absolute, was made under the crushing weight of existential threat. They were acutely, painfully aware that any public revelation of these suspected murders, this abhorrent scandal involving a polygamous family, would provide a devastating arsenal for anti-Mormon sentiment. It would invite federal intervention, a swift and brutal hammer blow that could utterly destroy their fragile community, threatening the very survival of their hard-won Zion. And so the darkest chapter was sealed. The entire incident, the unspeakable acts, the unearthed truths of Mr. Whitmore's 4 cursed wives were classified as strictly confidential, buried not in the earth but in the deepest, most inaccessible vaults of the church's archives. A truth suppressed, a history forbidden, a pact kept silent for over a century, all for the sake of survival. But some knowledge once whispered cannot be contained. Some truths once glimpsed cannot be unseen. You have heard it now. And this forbidden history, this glimpse into the true cost of unchecked power and corrupted faith, will stay with you. It will change you forever.